Pray with me now that the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. I've been thinking a lot about that young poet, Amanda Gorman, and her poetry at the inauguration earlier this month seemed to give us some hope. I'm fascinated with the decision to invite her to recite a poem at the Super Bowl next Sunday. She reminded me of so many other young, optimistic people who are shaking things up and challenging the status quo. I think about Nobel Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai, or Emma Gonzalez, or Marie Copeny, who wrote a letter to President Obama about the Flint water crisis when she was only 8 years old. It's like the mission of their art and their passion are sharing something with us, some really uncomfortable truths that are shaking us up. They are confronting the unclean spirits in our world today. They're challenging the unclean spirits of racism and pollution and climate change and sexism, and they're doing so with grace and dignity. But their missions have not been welcomed by everybody. And that reminds me of what we hear in Mark's gospel today. In this gospel passage, we hear about the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Now, he went around from town to town preaching, and often at the synagogues on the Sabbath. We hear that his preaching is riveting. We hear that it's challenging. His preaching was challenging enough to make at least one guy there in the synagogue come back at him and tell him to shut up. I've always seen this passage as a story of Jesus driving out an unclean spirit like an exorcism, right? Like Max von Sydow exorcising a demon in Linda Blair from that film, The Exorcist. But it's not. This time, as we heard the passage this morning, it felt more like a story from a town hall meeting. You get all these people who are gathered together in community. And I don't know, I listen to this, I don't see this man with the unclean spirit as being possessed by some kind of crazy demonic, but rather I see a man who's paralyzed with fear. I mean, Jesus had been preaching some things that were going to get people into trouble with the occupying empire. And this man was essentially listening to Jesus, and he was responding by saying, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? You preach like that, you're going to get us all killed." And I have to wonder, was this guy speaking from the unclean spirit, or was he speaking out as some kind of community member that was maybe designated to speak for the group, who was really fearful of what Jesus was preaching? Whatever it was, he was blatantly opposing what Jesus had to say. But at the same time, he's also acknowledging Jesus' presence as something that's holy too. As if to say, he's like, "You're the holy one, all right, but we don't need to hear this right now, y'all. We got to stick with the status quo. Anything else is too dangerous." And there's Jesus who's essentially saying, "My brother, the status quo sucks. And whatever fear is in you that's preventing you from seeing God's love and God's plan for us, get out. That just needs to shut up and get out of you right now." And it did. The unclean spirit of greed, the unclean spirit of fear, the unclean spirit of apathy or injustice or complacency, it was like poof, gone. And here was this man who got it. So while what Jesus was offering may not have been the kind of holy that that man wanted to hear that day, it was the kind of holy that that man needed to hear that day. It was the kind of holy that he needed to experience. Now, we don't know the identity of this man with the unclean spirit. He's just a guy in the Gospel of Mark. And he seems to possess a spirit of fear and content with the status quo and the way things were. But we don't know Or what we do know, I guess, is that he was changed that day. And we also know that the word about what happened got out. This story is wonderful in that it affirms that Jesus had this divine authority to just cast out these unclean spirits in our midst. And a couple of chapters later in Mark, we also learn that Jesus has affirmed in us this ability to also cast out unclean spirits. What kind of unclean spirits are we encountering today? How do we cast out these unclean spirits that are in our midst? As Jesus followers, as people who call ourselves Christians, we too are called to cast off the unclean spirits of greed and avarice and selfishness, the unclean spirits of fear and apathy and injustice and complacency. It leads me to ask, will we be a faithful or an unfaithful community as we patiently walk that trail that Jesus blazed for us? It's like this walking towards God's kingdom of loving justice for the entirety of the beloved community requires two things at once, which is hard for me to grasp. It requires both this kind of sense of urgency, like this has to get done right now. And at the same time, it's asking us for patience, knowing that the work will not be accomplished immediately. It's like Tom Petty said, the waiting is the hardest part. Every day you get one more yard, you take it on faith, you take it to the heart, but the waiting is the hardest part. I read recently that when it comes to tackling issues like injustice in our world, many of us have an impulse to push really hard and really fast. We're really eager to hit the accelerator, and we don't always want to pause to consider whether our zeal is prudent or appropriate at that moment. And this can often create a string of reactions in those that we want to reach by causing them to double down on our positions. That question the man with the unclean spirit asked of Jesus still resonates with us today, with those of us who fear change or perceive God's justice as a threat to our way of life. He says, have you come to destroy us? It's like, have you come to destroy us? What a question. And Mark is noting the first challenge to Jesus's ministry happens right here. We get a sense of just how challenging Jesus's ministry is going to be. And there were, for sure, more challenges that came, but with each account, Jesus always responds with love. And he always responds with the well-being of the beloved community at heart. And we still encounter challenges to Jesus's ministries in our families, in our communities, our governments, even within our own church. The Christian faith can be co-opted as a tool for empire. We've seen that. And Jesus also shows us how to push back. Sometimes that means flipping some tables. It means speaking truth to power with our own prophetic voices. It means naming evils in our world so that we might begin the task of confronting them. This also means modeling the way Jesus taught and responding with love and with patience. Even when walking into what might appear to be a situation with no positive transformation, it's still there. Following Jesus can create opposition, even with our own communities. But Jesus's authority will always prevail because we are called to be a people of love, of justice, and profound grace. What will this look like for you in our world today? Amen.